Good evening and welcome to this special commemoration meeting sponsored by the Institute of World Culture to honor, through appropriate observance, the contribution of a fearless fighter for truth and justice and freedom, whom we know as Mahatma Gandhi. My name is Carolyn Dorrance, and I'm currently serving as the President and Program Coordinator for the Institute. Information about the Institute can be found on the tables in the back. We have brochures, flyers of our upcoming events, a registration form if you want to be in our email list, a schedule of events for this particular winter quarter. It looks like this. And a number of books that are related to tonight's topic that you can look at and purchase if you wish. We're gathered to honor a very special human being, one of the fearless fighters for truth and justice and nonviolence. In so doing, we challenge ourselves to understand the thought, the principles, the life of this being. No doubt all of us are gathered here in part because we're horrified by the violence and injustice that sweeps across our world. We're all too aware of the suffering of great numbers of human beings. We're also concerned, no doubt, with how we can participate in, as a citizen, both of this country and of the world. Our ordinary means of politics seem sterile. There seems little we can do to actually change the policies of our government. And Gandhi was quite aware of the limitations of a simply secular approach to political action. He pioneered in a way to develop the human potential to see beyond any particular country or law or partial loyalties, and to understand, to seek through that transcendence to draw upon a deeper potential in human being for freedom and commitment to fearless transformation of both themselves and the society in which they live. We are fortunate to have with us a speaker who is deeply immersed for many, many years in the philosophy and the ethical principles of Mahatma Gandhi. Professor Nandini Iyer is born in India, and her family was actively engaged in Gandhi's nonviolent reform movement and in social reform and working for women's freedom. She has gained her education there in India for her first degree, and then graduated with honors in economics and philosophy, showing already a capacity to blend ideas with a concern for social order and justice. She continued her studies in England at the University of Oxford, where she won further first-class honors degrees in philosophy, politics, and economics, specializing in philosophical logic. While at Oxford, she was president for the Plotinus Society for the study of mysticism and president of the Omkar Mandal for the study of Indian philosophy and mysticism. She returned to India and married Professor Raghavan Iyer, with whom she came to Santa Barbara and co-founded the Institute. She briefly taught at the University of Delhi while in India before returning to Oxford, where they both taught philosophy for several years. She also did radio and television broadcasting for the BBC. In the mid-1960s, the Iyers moved with their young son, Pico Iyer, to California, where they both taught at UCSB. She taught first in the Department of Philosophy and then in the Department of Religious Studies, and she taught a great number of courses in mysticism, religious systems, and the list is quite long. She's also taught for adult education, and she's taught philosophy and comparative religion at Santa Barbara City College. She's given a number of talks to a variety of audiences on mysticism and many other religious studies topics. She's presented papers and talks at international conferences on the place of religion in a global society and for the need for comparative religion in schools today. She is co-editor with her husband of the book The Descent of the Gods, the mystical writings of George William Russell, which was published in England. And as said, she is the co-founder of the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara, and she continues to give talks, seminars, conferences all around the country. And she has been given the Congressional Award of Honor for encouraging and participating in interfaith and intercultural dialogue. And I think you'll find this evening that while we'll be challenged, having come out on this very rainy evening, for which we thank you, but you'll be challenged to consider the most complex of philosophical principles, but you will hear many examples of how we can be better citizens. Gandhi has said, "I have not a shadow of doubt that any man or woman can achieve what I have." If that is true, we will be richly rewarded by our education tonight from Professor Nandini Iyer.
Sisters and brothers, I use this form of address deliberately instead of the usual formal one, not only because Gandhiji himself always addressed his audiences in this manner, but because it expresses the essential basis of his idea of nonviolence. On the 30th of January, 1948, as Gandhiji prepared to leave Birla House where he was staying to go to his usual evening universal prayer meeting held at the end of the garden, he was approached by the Delhi Chief of Police. The Chief of Police had received, through his intelligence sources, more than usually strong evidence of an assassination plot against Gandhi. For quite some time, of course, there had been many such rumors and death plots and rumors of death plots against the Mahatma. But this was different, the chief felt, and he had a strong feeling that this rumor was truly a very grave threat to be taken seriously. He begged Gandhi to allow him to send a few of his police officers to protect him. But Gandhi, despite the chief's increasingly urgent pleas, refused, saying that to be defended by armed police would go against all the principles that he himself had espoused, had taught, and had tried to live by. He had always decried the use of physical weapons, and this would make a mockery of his own life and principles, would be an act of cowardice and hypocrisy. In other words, of violence. Remarking that for the first time ever, the conversation with the chief of police had made him a little bit late for his meeting, he stepped out onto the garden path. Within moments, he was surrounded as his followers and sympathizers milled around him, greeting him with folded hands, palms joined, and in a gesture of traditional Indian reverence. But in an instant, out of a man emerged who also approached Gandhi with folded hands, as if about to do honor to him. And instead of doing honor to him, in an instant, his hands unfolded, a gun emerged, and he shot Gandhi at point-blank range. Tremendous chaos, of course, followed among the crowds around Gandhi. But those close to him, even in the midst of their terrible agony and astonishment and surprise, those around him noticed not only that he called out the name of God as he was shot, but that he attempted to extend his hand in a gesture of forgiveness towards his assassin as he fell to the ground. A few minutes later, my uncle, who was his personal physician, had the painful and sad duty of signing Gandhi's death certificate. Surprisingly, but perhaps in the end, fortunately for India, the assassin turned out to be not a Muslim, as many had thought he might be, but a fascist, fundamentalist Hindu. Given the manner of his death, that even at the point of death, his thoughts were of God and his gesture was one of forgiveness, it is hardly surprising that Einstein thought that generations to come will scarcely believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth. The truth about Gandhi's nonviolence is that it is not one virtue or form of goodness among many others, but one great virtue or good that expresses itself in a myriad different forms, depending on the context and situation in which it is expressed. It may be, and depending on the situation, those around may emphasize the courage, some may emphasize the self-sacrifice, some may emphasize the love, the forgiveness, the non-retaliation, the patience. But as far as Gandhi was concerned, these were all expressions of that one supreme virtue. Plato had said that we think of many virtues, but actually virtue is one. And that is exactly what Gandhi felt. The names of the different expressions of this one virtue differ, but in the end, they are, as we said, facets of the same great energy or virtue. For Gandhi, as with all the people that have taught this kind of philosophy, virtue is not simply occasionally practiced, nor is it only expressed through specific and discrete acts of nonviolence. This one virtue has been, of course, taught by many long before Gandhi. The great propounders and practitioners of nonviolence and love of the past have taught essentially the same thing that Gandhi did, and indeed, he frequently called upon and made references to these great teachers. For Jesus, it was love, loving your neighbor as yourself under all conditions. For St. Paul, it was what in the King James Version of the Bible is translated as charity and is now translated as love, love for one's fellow human beings, unstinting, uncompromising, and all-encompassing love. The Buddha called it karuna, or compassion for all living beings. And so on. In the Gita, it is called being able to see God in all beings and all beings in God. And whether we call it karuna or St. Paul's charity or loving one's neighbor as oneself or whatever, we see again that this is the supreme virtue. And Gandhi, although he spoke both of truth and nonviolence, spoke of patience, non-retaliation, and so on, in the end, for him, the essence of it was contained in ahimsa, which means nonviolence. So, as I said, For Gandhi, as with all these other teachers, it was not something that you expressed occasionally and on discrete occasions and specific occasions. Of course, it must always be expressed in the appropriate situations and occasions when occasion demands. But these specific and particular actions arise out of an all-encompassing attitude, an all-embracing mental and moral perspective. In short, Gandhi's nonviolence, like Jesus's love or Buddha's compassion, is a total way of life, and therefore very demanding. It means that we have to change our entire perspective. And of course, this is not something that anyone, whether it be Jesus, Buddha, or Gandhi, or the Gita, expects us to do immediately. But the goal is this basic principle on which we live our lives. That has to be changed, and not just a sporadic expression of it. So it is that principle then which becomes the very core of our being. When we have understood it, when we have, as it were, digested it and made it a part of ourselves, it becomes that which determines and directs the behavior of the body, the manners of the mind, the hungerings of the heart, and the sympathies of the soul. In other words, every aspect of our lives. This may make nonviolence an impossibly high ideal or virtue for the ordinary person to practice. But let's not use this as an excuse, not even to try to begin to practice it. After all, no great ideal is instantly achieved. No virtue is immediately practiced perfectly. We begin in small ways. Lao Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, says that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that is precisely what Gandhi assured us that we could do. Each one of us can and must begin in our own specific and individual way and practice it in maybe tiny, seemingly trivial ways, but we can still practice nonviolence. Perhaps by refusing to retaliate on some particular occasion when a person does something which is harmful, says something which hurts us. We can begin in such small ways, but keep always in mind the idea that we should build upon this small incident and next time perhaps practice it in a more difficult situation. We must recognize too that imperfect and fallible as we are, we may succeed in practicing nonviolence once now and then drunk with success, and being drunk with success itself is a backward step, we may fail miserably the next time around. It's not an easy path, as Jesus, Buddha, and the others who walked it warned us. After all, Jesus said, straight is the gate and narrow the path that leads to salvation. It's not this smooth, easy road that leads in the other direction. And whether it be Buddha, the Christ, the Hindu seers, all of us, however, assured us that fallible though we may be, we carry within us the seeds of perfection. We are all Buddhas in the making, said Buddha. And this was something that deeply influenced Gandhi, who was influenced by the Christian tradition, by the Jain tradition, by the Buddhist tradition, as well as by the Hindu and the Muslim tradition. The ideal, the highest state of perfection, is attainable, Gandhi firmly believed, by every one of us. A French writer once said, the ideal is only truth at a distance, which is why Gandhi insisted that steadfast hope was an essential in trying to live the nonviolent life. So let us see what are the different facets and elements of Gandhi's nonviolence might be. And when it all seems too difficult, let us remember that, as Einstein said, some of us may wonder that such a person actually walked the earth, but he did. And he himself, as we know, was not at all agreeable to being addressed or referred to as the Mahatma, which means great soul. He preferred to be called Bapu or Bapuji. Bapu means father, and that's what he felt everybody should refer to him and address him as. Now, not only in the distant past, as in the time of Christ and Buddha, but since the time of Gandhi, we have had several inspiring examples of men and women who are in our own increasingly troubled and complex and violent world have practiced Gandhian nonviolence. We have only to think of Martin Luther King, Danilo Dolci, the Sicilian Gandhi, who saved his country's poor from the clutches, the tyrannical and combined hold of the church as well as of the mafia. We think of Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar or Burma. We think of the bhikkhu or monk, Mahad Goshananda of Cambodia. We think of the Dalai Lama and other many, many brave individuals who have had the true love and the courage to practice this greatest of all virtues. All of them have dared and have had the courage to walk through the valley of the shadow of death without fearing any evil to themselves. So in terms of Gandhian nonviolence, what are the qualities, beliefs, ideals that these brave souls have in common? First of all, we must understand that Gandhi repeatedly emphasized that nonviolence is not the same as passive resistance. It's true that early on in his career in South Africa, he did use the term passive resistance, but later he rejected that because he felt it had too much of a negative, weak connotation. There is nothing passive about Gandhian nonviolence. It is active, it is proactive, but it is activity of a certain kind, arising from an inner peacefulness and love. Gandhi often said that in war, the external physical violence was only a part of the violence. Most of the violence lay in the minds and the hearts of the participants. Nonviolence is not merely the desire not to hurt others and not to harm others. For Gandhi, it was the desire, positive desire, to want to extend love to the so-called enemy. In fact, he didn't like to use the word enemy, to the other person. And so it involved a positive attempt on the part of the nonviolent practitioner to extend love and understanding to the other person. And this is why he didn't want to call it passive. The key to the understanding of Gandhi's nonviolence lies in the complex relationship he envisioned between what he called satya, which is truth, the highest truth, and ahimsa, or nonviolence. For him, the two were inseparable. They were like two sides of the same coin. The same coin, which is the higher reality, or God. Though sometimes he said he equated truth with God and God with truth. And from this relation arose a complex set of intimate connections between other qualities that Gandhi highly prized. Now, while it may seem extremely abstract and abstruse and intellectual for the ordinary person to understand this relationship between abstract and absolute truth and relative truth and so on, we'll see that actually we can, in our own way, understand it in extremely practical, personal, experiential terms. Gandhi maintained that the roots of outward violence lie in an inner, mental, psychological, and moral violence. We are all, alas, all too familiar with such inner violence. Gandhi, although no academic philosopher, was truly a philosopher in the old Greek sense of the term, a lover of wisdom. He read a tremendous amount, but never simply swallowed and lapped up the ideas of others. Whatever he believed in, whatever thoughts and ideas he came across, he pondered, he analyzed, he examined to see how they fit in with what he felt was innately true. So he asked questions, he probed into what he read and heard, thought things out for himself, and he encouraged everyone else to do the same. So again, this idea of absolute and relative truth, although, as I said, abstract and perhaps difficult for us to understand, what he was saying was that there's absolute truth, which, if you like, is God, and this is inexpressible in words. Words cannot contain it. It's an ideal to be constantly and continuously striven after in the human quest for perfectibility. This truth or God is not separate from us. This was very important for Gandhi. Not separate from us, but rather constitutes the very center and core of our innermost being. The quest for God is the quest for truth, and both are the quest for self-knowledge. What we know with the intellect and can express in language is relative truth. By honest questioning, and deep thinking, we can rise to higher and higher levels of relative truth, more universal truths, more all-encompassing, moving towards the absolute truth. But what is all this, we might say, to do with the practice of nonviolence? Well, Gandhi believed that it is when we refuse to acknowledge that what we believe is in itself only the relative truth, perhaps. Not necessarily completely false, but partially true, one-sided. It's only when we refuse to acknowledge this and recognize this, that we begin to slide down the precipitous slope of intolerance towards violence. If I think that what I believe is completely and absolutely true, then if anyone dares to contradict me, if anyone has a different set of beliefs, then I'm forced to say that they are completely false. In saying that they're completely false, I'm already doing them a kind of psychological and moral violence. I'm in fact saying that they do not have the ability, they do not have the right, rather, to think for themselves. They do not have the right to have their own set of beliefs, that they must, if they're going to walk on the right path, adopt my point of view and my point of view only. Already, as I said, we have shown intolerance, a lack of civility, and this intolerance and this shutting out of others, refusing to acknowledge their truth as having any validity in it, is the beginning of violence. And this mental and psychological and moral violence that I do to the other person whom I completely reject in terms of his or her beliefs, this may well and often does result in physical violence. So although that relation between absolute and relative truth, as I said, may seem abstract, we can see that we at least have to make the attempt to understand what there might be, the little even grain of truth there might be in what the other person is saying. It's only in that way that we can learn, that we can grow. If otherwise we become very tunnel visioned and, of course, intolerant and dogmatic. So I have to learn to see that the beliefs of others, which are different from my own, may be partially false, but they may also have a great deal of truth in them. And therefore, I have to learn to understand the person and understand why he or she believes what he or she does. It was only on that basis that I can hope to have civil conversation and exchange of views with them. Otherwise, as I said, I cut off those whose beliefs are different from my own completely from the circle of my sympathy. I become hostile. The seeds of violence are already present in my intolerance. As I said, I violate the other person's right to have his or her own beliefs, to think for herself. And from this inner intolerance and violence may, as I said, emerge physical violence. Gandhi believed that it was important to be aware of this, and try to change. Now, we could say that Gandhi was very concerned with trying to change what we think and how we live. Of course he was. But he believed that it was just as important, if not more important, to examine and change how we think and why we live. What is the motive for our living? For him, it was nonviolence and truth. And this is where we come to the heart of Gandhian nonviolence, fearlessness. What has fearlessness got to do with nonviolence, we might well ask. After all, a nonviolent person, people might say, is not going to fight physically. So what's he or she afraid of? He's not going into armed combat. Such a question would only betray our own ignorance of true nonviolence. The nonviolent person is not a coward. Rather, he or she has to instill in himself or herself the greatest courage, both physical and moral. Gandhi used to say, which is more difficult? Which person has shows the greater courage? The person who, facing a so-called enemy armed to the teeth, himself goes to confront him similarly armed? Or is it the person who, facing an enemy armed to the teeth, goes out to confront him or her with no physical weapons at all? Who requires and who has the greater courage? It is clearly the one who goes out with nothing but love as his shield and faith in his fellow human beings as his weapon. So Gandhi pointed out that this fearlessness is of the essence of nonviolence. Now, again, he did not expect that everyone would have the fearlessness and the courage to be able right from the beginning to sacrifice their lives. There were many who did and lost their lives, and he himself, of course, was always willing to do this. But he didn't expect that all his followers should be able to do this. But he said, well, do as much as you can. Maybe you're not ready to sacrifice your life. Maybe you're afraid to die, but all right, do as much as you can. So he was fully aware that we cannot immediately all practice this perfect nonviolence. It's not easy, after all, to develop this kind of fearlessness. True, we may say we believe in the immortality of the soul and that ultimately we are deathless, immortal souls. But though the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. Our frail personality cringes. It protests against this apparent assault on its most basic instincts of self-preservation and self-defense. Let's face it, the majority of us, whatever our beliefs might be, are afraid of death. And we're also afraid of physical and psychological harm. Gandhi fully recognized and understood this. He realized not everyone, indeed only the very rare individual, is ready to sacrifice, as I said, his or her life in a nonviolent cause. But he didn't expect everyone to do so. Everyone is capable, to some degree, to restrain himself or herself from retaliating violently to physical force. Everyone is capable of curbing his or her impulses to initiate violence. And perhaps we are all capable at some point of trying, in fact, to understand and love the other person. Everyone, said Gandhi, however weak, apparently weak, even women and children are capable of summoning up the power of nonviolence action, not merely in matters, not only in matters necessarily of global and societal concern, but perhaps at home, in household matters, in family matters. And this, after all, is a beginning. Gandhi, for instance, gave the example from the Hindu myth of the young boy Prahlad, who faced his father's torture and threats of death, but would not do the wrong thing. In spite of, and not only would not do the wrong thing in the face of all these threats, but continued to love his father. Nonviolence is difficult because it requires great courage and fearlessness and a willingness to engage in some degree of self-sacrifice. It goes contrary to our selfish impulses. Nonviolence requires us to respect others and have faith in one's own moral strength. A nonviolent person does not aim at humiliating anyone, but hopes to make them see what is right, so that both sides, in fact, in the end, emerge victorious. And yet, in our own time, we do see, as I've said, individuals who have been willing to do all these things. Did Martin Luther King hesitate when he was faced with threats of all kinds against him and his family, faced with threats of terrible consequences for his nonviolent attempts to win civil rights, something that was the birthright of every American, to win civil rights for those who had long been denied them? He and many others of all races suffered and lost their lives in the civil rights movement so that the oppressed might have justice. They were not fighting for themselves, they were fighting for others. They were giving their lives for others. They were facing fearlessly what may be one of the most insidious yet powerful forces of injustice: racial prejudice, intolerance, and hatred. We have also the inspiring example, as I've mentioned before, of Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar, of Burma, who fearlessly practiced nonviolence despite all the attacks on her, the attempts to, and the actual success in imprisoning her. I believe she's actually still under house arrest. And above all, when we think, can we even imagine what it must have been like for her? Can we imagine what she must have felt in having to make the decision when her husband, who was living in England, was found to be terminally ill with cancer? The Burmese government refused to give him a visa to come and visit her. They told her she could have a visa to go and visit him in England. Now think of the terrible, torturous decision she had to make. And in the end, she had the courage to do what she felt, not what she herself wanted, but what was good for her people and her country. She knew that if she left, they would let her leave, but they would never let her come back into Burma. And so her people would be left without her leadership, without her help and comfort. So she made this tremendously agonizing decision not to go and see her husband before he died. Now, again, it requires tremendous courage and a love of one's fellow human beings to be able to make this sacrifice. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has the strength to continue to love the Chinese, despite all they have done to his country and his people and his religion. He fearlessly continues to insist on a nonviolent approach, even when some of his own people in exile are vociferously advocating violence as the only solution. He goes about with no concern for his own safety in the face of a sect in his own religion that has clearly shown its intention of harming him, perhaps even killing him. But in turn, he has inspired thousands of Tibetans in Tibet to offer nonviolent resistance, and to show no hatred towards those who oppress and torture them. We have the inspiring example of the Buddhist monk Mahatma in Cambodia. He's often called the Gandhi of Cambodia. At the height of the almost unimaginable horrors and bloodshed brought about by the Khmer Rouge, Mahatma, constantly risking torture and death, went about quietly among the people, preaching nonviolence, love, and non-retaliation against the death squads of he preached this to the people of Cambodia. When the land of Cambodia finally stopped being the killing fields that it had been, most of the simple, ordinary people of this ravaged country showed a remarkable, almost unbelievable lack of feelings of hatred, anger, or revenge towards their former oppressors and killers. I myself was there when just after the war was ended, and I was moved, as I have seldom been on any other occasion, by the gentle, compassionate attitude of these simple Cambodian people who had suffered so greatly. They simply claimed they were trying to follow what the Buddha had taught. They said, we are Buddhists. Buddha taught that we should love. And in fact, they would quote what was one of Gandhi's own favorite quotations from the Buddha: hatred ceaseth not by hatred, but by love. This is the law eternal. And they simply said this, and they said, if we show feelings of retaliation and hatred, if we want to immediately execute these people and bring torture and death to them, we would be sinking to the same level as those who had oppressed us, the Khmer Rouge. We do not want to do that. We believe in karma. The worst punishment they can get is not from us, but what will come to them, presumably under karma. It was brought home to me with compelling force how right Gandhi was when he said that war and violence can never bring about a true peace. The seeds of bitterness, anger, humiliation are the consequences of any war, and they inevitably contain the seeds of further violence and another war. Gandhi said, no country has ever become or will ever become happy through victory in war. In fact, a victorious nation, he said, being full of pride, becomes overbearing. In fact, what comes to it, Gandhi said, is defeat, not victory. What is set in motion is a vicious cycle of hatred and bitterness, violence and war, and innumerable other problems. After all, the First World War, as we remember, was said to be the war to end all wars. But what it did was sow the seeds of World War II. And that in turn sowed the seeds of the Cold War and its proliferation into other areas, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. And on the other hand, some of the consequences of World War II, indirectly at least, led to the whole Palestinian-Israel problem and the chaos that we see in the Middle East today. So war can never bring about peace. It may bring about a cessation of physical hostilities for a while, but the inner feelings that are left behind are not of nonviolence or love. Nonviolence has thus both a moral and a practical justification for it. If war simply leads to other wars, then there is a practical justification or reason not to engage in it. Gandhi did for the would-be practitioner of nonviolence. He did distinguish between nonviolence as a policy and nonviolence as a creed. An individual who follows nonviolence as a policy only, that is, because it promises a successful outcome, is of course to be encouraged on that particular occasion. But he is not a true practitioner of nonviolence. For if he does not engage in nonviolence, because of its innate moral value, then on another occasion, when the practice of nonviolence does not promise to be practically successful, and when it requires too much self-sacrifice, too much wounded pride, this person will not, in fact, practice it. The person who believes in nonviolence as a creed, that is, who holds it as the basic principle of his life and his thought and actions, holds determinedly to it because it is the right thing to do and not because it will necessarily succeed in the world. It may, and he hopes that he will, but the important thing is to do what is right, to do what is according to the moral law, God's law, the eternal law, universal moral law, whatever we like to call it. And then such a person will practice it regardless of the consequences to himself, giving up all thought of personal success or failure. He would practice what the Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi's favorite book, calls renunciation of the fruits of action. This detachment from the personal consequences brought about as a result of the pursuit of nonviolence as something intrinsically right and good is also part of Gandhi's idea on the what it means, what nonviolence means. And here we come to another aspect of his philosophy. And it's interesting that while many, many others, even the people I have mentioned and people from the past and people in the present have practiced nonviolence, as well as Gandhi, hardly anyone has thought out the basic principles of nonviolence as thoroughly and clearly as Gandhi did. As I said, in spite of the fact that he was not a philosopher in any ordinary sense of the term. But he said another thing which is very important is the relation between means and ends. If we use violent or immoral means, we can never, in the light of the eternal moral laws and principles of the universe, it can never lead to a harmonious or good end. And the end never, never justifies the means. This is a principle that we today, in the global social, economic, and political scene, need to take extremely seriously. Gandhi believed that this fearlessness that he advocated springs from a hard-won discipline of one's own persona, a self-transformation and self-transcendence that is accompanied by a detachment from personal desires and an attempt to show love and justice to all living beings. It's certainly a difficult goal, as I said, to aspire to, because it involves faith in God or some higher reality or law. It involves trust in one's fellow human beings, hard for us to have. I mentioned all living beings, and it is interesting to note that Gandhi included nonviolence, inward and outward, towards animals and plants. He didn't simply say we must show it to human beings, and to the earth itself. We are the guardians of the earth and the creatures below us. We hold the riches of the earth, he said, as trustees on behalf of all beings. He said that a nation, the greatness of a nation can be judged by the treatment it gives to animals. From a Gandhian, and we only have to look on the one hand at the pampered pets with their diamond collars and silk cushions on the one hand, and at the way the cattle that are bred for meat and so on are treated, the way animals are tortured, blinded, maimed, not only for the sake of medical research, but by the cosmetic companies. Rabbits are blinded in order to try out new kinds of mascara. What is the end? The end is greater profits for the cosmetic company. So again, Gandhi did not, in his ideas of nonviolence, leave out all these other aspects of the earth and creatures on the earth. So his nonviolence was on behalf of all beings. From a Gandhian point of view, therefore, our present environmental problems, ecological crisis, would all be the result of the violence we have done to all the kingdoms of nature because of our selfishness and rapacious greed. He would say that mere physical changes in what we are doing and in our habits are not enough. And we must realize that for the globe to survive, we have to change our whole attitude, not only to other human beings, but to nature, to animals, to plants. We have to change our whole set of priorities of values. We have to learn to curb our insatiable wants. The earth, as he pointed out, can provide for all our simple needs, but, said Gandhi, it cannot support our ridiculous luxuries. This brings us to another aspect of Gandhi's nonviolence, the vow of poverty. Passive resistance or nonviolence can only be a personal force for the good, he said, by the performing practitioner, if he takes no thought for the morrow for himself, as Jesus might have said. Incredibly difficult as this may be, we can all hold it as an ideal. This effort alone can make nonviolence an irresistible force, a soul force, as Gandhi called it. An individual who practices this is always, said Gandhi, the victor, not in the literal and external sense, but in the sense that she has not given up her principles and has maintained the integrity of her inner being by not thinking of herself, but of the welfare of others, by rooting out anger and greed and hate from within, and viewing the opposition not as an enemy, but as another human being to be loved and, if possible, understood. Gandhi would have agreed with the 19th century mystic who said, "No man is your enemy, no man is your friend. All alike are your teachers." The Buddha himself disarmed and converted to the true way a brutal murderer simply by approaching him unafraid and with a heart full of love and compassion. This deep, hard-won inner soul integrity or wholeness is part of what Gandhi meant by satyagraha. Satyagraha means, well, it has many meanings, but it literally means holding on to truth. The significance of satyagraha consists in Gandhi said, in the quest for a principle of life. For him, this was the primary goal of the quest for all. The winning of India's independence, he said, was, at least for him, only a secondary goal. Satyagraha, holding on to truth, soul force, love, these were all terms that he used. This holding on to truth arises from an ability, as we've seen, to recognize one's own beliefs as only partially true or perhaps false, and a willingness to learn from anyone and everyone else. For Gandhi, truth was not simply an intellectual, logical, epistemological theory. To be true to the highest ideals meant to true oneself, as in the old sense of the word, the carpenter trues a line, a plane, or an edge, aligning it so it is absolutely straight and true. It is a constant process of alignment and realignment, of finding a dynamic and constantly shifting inner point of balance, harmony, equanimity, and peace. The willingness in all humanity to admit one's errors. Gandhi himself often spoke of his Himalayan blunders. In our own political situation today, do we not see the far-reaching, dire, terrible consequences of leaders refusing to admit that they were wrong? They lack the humility and courage to make such an admission. Gandhi also spoke of the equal distribution of wealth and resources, for individuals and nations. He believed that the nonviolent approach required the rich to become guardians of the poor. Equality need not be taken literally so that everyone has exactly the same amount of money. But he said when an individual becomes a servant of society, earns for its sake, and spends for its benefit, then there is nonviolence in his efforts. Again, Gandhi was pointing to the ideal, not expecting everyone to begin immediately to live up to it. Certainly, even even the Gandhian ideals that would prevent, certainly the following and the practice of Gandhian ideals would prevent the massive exploitation of the poor that is so rampant in our world today. We are horrified at the acts of huge corporations, often in secret alliance with governments, that economically invade poor third world countries, take over control of the people's resources, water, for instance, farmers' seeds, under the guise of helping the country, and then deprive the people of their most essential resources. For example, the taking ownership by huge corporations of farmers' seed sources and supplies, denying farmers the right to save their own harvested seeds, forcing them to buy seeds from these corporations, has in India driven tens and hundreds of thousands of farmers into debt. And at a very mild estimate, it has caused 21,000 farmers at least in India to commit suicide. Even water has been privatized and sold back to the people to whom it rightly belonged. The corporations, under the guise of helping a country, actually sink it into ever-increasing debt and eventually gain, therefore, the political power to place their own corrupt puppets into positions of power. But even these seemingly invincible corporations have been known to have their enormous power curtailed and their invasive tactics stopped by the nonviolent resistance of a group of fearless, selfless people. The apparently impossible has been accomplished. Gandhi's idealistic proposals may seem impossible to follow, but then has any great religious or moral leader ever wrought any change for the better by advocating less than the highest principles, goals, or ideals? It is often said a river cannot rise above its source. The higher the ideal set before us, the more we strive. The moral leader has taught anything, no moral leader has taught anything less than the highest absolute principles. No one has set petty goals, relative principles as commandments or rules. No great teacher has expected us to be less than perfect. Even Jesus said, "Be perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." It is this unconquerable hope in the perfectibility of human beings, an unshakable faith in the goodness of humanity that has inspired men and women to rise to unexpected heights of nobility and self-sacrifice. Gandhi did no less than this, and we can do no less than to fulfill at least some of his expectations. After all, we have explored all too thoroughly the way of hatred and violence. And we've explored that pretty thoroughly, and it has failed us utterly. Can we not try the way of Gandhi, the way of Christ, the way of Buddha, and of the Gita? We have nothing to lose, and we have everything to gain. We have also not only everything to gain, but we have the possibility of preserving our inmost integrity and purity. Perhaps we could sum up Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence through the words of Shelley in Prometheus Unbound, where Shelley extols the Titan Prometheus, who sacrificed himself, suffered tremendous tortures so that humanity might continue to live and to flourish. to suffer woes which hope thinks infinite, to forgive wrongs darker than death or night, to defy power which seems omnipotent, to love and bear, to hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. Neither to change nor falter nor repent, this like thy glory, Titan, is to be good, great, and joyous, beautiful and free. This is alone life, joy, empire, and victory. Thank you.